Okay, cool. So, hi everyone. Philadelphia's wonderful this time of year. Just kidding. I'm sure it is. So I am pleased and privileged to be able to talk with you a little bit about application state management, specifically in React. And my big assertion for this talk is that React is a state management library and that you don't need much else for most cases. So if you're interested, my slides are on GitHub, application state management talk. And yeah, this is just a bunch of stuff about me. I am in Utah in my home. You can see kind of a picture of my family. I've got a wife and a daughter and 3 boys and a dog that's behind my head. And yeah, the last thing I would just want to mention is testingjavascript.com. If you haven't taken a look at that, definitely look at that. And I've got a workshop scheduled right now. That's a remote workshop, so you don't have to like fly in. You can wear your pajamas if you want to. And we're going to be talking about making React applications fast. It's the React Performance Workshop. So go take a look at that. Early bird is happening right now. I'm not going to invite you to stand. Anytime I do it remotely, it's always kind of awkward. So normally I like to do air squats before my talks, but we're not going to do that. You can feel free to do air squats later if you want to. Okay, cool. So just a couple of expectations. I am going to help build the case that application state management doesn't have to be as difficult as we sometimes make it, and that you may not need Redux, MobX, or anything other than just React. This talk is not going to be dogmatic, though, so I am cognizant of the fact that Redux does have a place, and MobX and all these different application state management libraries do have a place in the world, but my assertion is just that we don't have to reach for them as quickly. Yeah, so here are a bunch of frequently asked questions that I don't want to have to answer. You can ask them as frequently as you want, but I don't want to have to answer them frequently. So that's why I put those there. Okay, so we'll just get started. So application state management is a hard problem. There's the saying that goes that there are 2 hard problems in computer science: caching and naming things. And caching is actually kind of like state management in an application, in a web application at least, because as soon as, if we're talking about Twitter, for example, as soon as you load those tweets from the server, as soon as that happens, you basically have a cache of tweets, and that cache could be invalid as soon as it shows up. So like there are new favorites on the tweets. There are new tweets that have happened, but you haven't loaded yet. Those tweets that you have may have been edited. Oh, wait, no, that can't happen. Curse you, Jack. But there are things that can happen on the server that you don't have in your application. So it's basically a caching problem. The other side of things is UI-only state. So it's not really a caching thing. It's things that are happening in the UI, like if you have a drop-down that is open state, that's going to be a UI type state. So there are these different types of state, and it is a really hard problem either way. But typically I find that it can be a little over-engineered, and that's what we're going to look into here getting started. So thinking about state, we're going to look at an example component tree. So let's imagine that you're on twitter.com and you're looking through your thread. You've got some components over here, you've got some over here and over here. So that's what we're looking at. You have your app, you have your left nav with a bunch of links and a drop-down for the more right here, and then a tweet button, and then you have your main content here. And so from there, you have your tweet input, you have the timeline with a bunch of tweets in there, and then you have your write controls for the search, the trends, who to follow, the meta links, all of that stuff. Okay, so think about this really quick. I'm going to bump this down. Hopefully you can all still see it pretty well, but I want to see more on the screen. What in here do you think is global state? So we've got a couple of things. We have tweets. Are those global? Does everything in the application need to know about the tweets? Does the left nav need to know about the tweets that are loaded? Does the right control need to know about the tweets are loaded? Does the tweet input even need to know about what tweets are loaded? Maybe not. We've got the more button drop down that is open state of that. That probably is just a local state for our dropdown. And then the who to follow accounts, those accounts that show up in that who to follow area, I don't think the whole application needs to know about that. The currently logged in user, the whole application probably does need to know about that. You've got who to follow over here that probably needs to know, who's requesting this to know who that person should be following. You have the profile link here. We need to know what profile it is. And then the tweet input, we need to know who's making the tweet. So yeah, having the logged in user, I would say that's application, like global application state. And so what happens kind of historically is we were trying to manage state and we ran into this thing called the prop drilling problem that we'll look into a little bit more later, where basically you have your state that you're managing, you're passing it down to all of these components throughout your application. It's really painful. Anybody who's built a real production level application in React has experienced this pain before. And so we came up with a couple of ways to address this. And one of the nice things about React is the one-way data flow. And so Facebook came out with this idea of Flux as a way of, here your data travels down your tree, and then you call up to this function that updates the data, and then it flows down the tree again. And we had that time period was like a year or two of the Flux wars. And then finally Redux came, and Redux was simple enough in its implementation that we all just loved it to death. And I would actually assert that the biggest reason that Redux was really successful and successful over the others is because it was so simple. And then the reason that it took off is because it solved the prop drilling problem for people. That connect React Redux higher order component that you could use meant that you could put all of your application state right here in this store. So you'd say provider, that's the React Redux provider. Then you have your store, you put your store in here, and then you're off to the races. You just wrap your whole app in here, provider. And now you have anything that's in your store is accessible to you because we have this magical provider, and we just connect things to the store, and now we have access to our state. And what ends up happening as part of this is you get all of the benefits of middleware and everything else. And so let's say you want to track whether somebody is opening the dropdown for analytics purposes or something like that. Well, then we have some middleware that we can use to track analytics. So let's just put that state in our global store, and then our middleware will just take care of that automatically, which is awesome. And then what happens is we start to put more and more state in this global application state management tool, and that level of indirection makes it really hard to maintain the code base. And so while it was all well-intentioned, it just kind of becomes the default that we put all of the application state into our global application state management tool, or Redux in this case, or whatever tool it is that you're using. And that ends up not being a great thing because of this indirection, because anytime you need to maintain any component, if you need to do anything with state, you have to open like 30 files just to follow along the code path to see what's going on. And so there are a lot of benefits to having something like Redux, but at the cost of this huge amount of complexity and indirection by putting things that absolutely are not application level state into that state management solution. So that's why my assertion here is that React is a state management library. I actually used Redux in one application when I was at PayPal, and used it long enough to realize that I didn't like what developers end up doing with it, just naturally end up doing with it by loading everything into the Redux store. And so I started playing around with Redux or with React as a state management library. And it's the one that you don't have to yarn add or npm install because it's already installed. And it's one that you don't have to learn any more than you already should, because it's just the React API. And with hooks, things have become a lot better, especially when we talk about context, which we'll get into here in a second. But if you haven't ever experienced this before, because I have seen applications that 100% are using Redux for every piece of state in the whole app, so they never have component state, which is a big problem. But if you haven't ever seen this before, this is how you manage state with hooks. You have this React use state. You also have a use reducer, and then you have a mechanism for updating that state, and you have that state itself. And that's how you manage state. It's really quite simple. This is how you should be building most of your React components, is this localized state. So the problem that people typically bring up or run into when they start doing localized state like this is, how do I share the state that's in this component with another one? So this is where we get into lifting state up. So here we have this counter component, we have a count display component, and they're both being rendered by the app here. So I have this state that's living in the counter component. How do I get that to the count display? Like, I could pass a count prop here. We'll accept that as a prop here, count. Okay, but where am I going to get this value? And that's the big question that people have. So what lifting state up, it basically does is you say, okay, you have these two sibling components, or maybe this is like a grandchild or something, but you have these components that need to share state with each other. So you'll go up the React tree until you find the one component that is the closest common parent of these components. So for this contrived example, that's our app component. And then you'll move your state management to that component, and then pass as props the things that the component that was managing the state before needs. So for example, we need a count, and I'm actually going to move the increment helper function here too. So we'll have a on increment click. Okay. Then we'll pass that as a prop to on click here. So then here I can say my count is count, and on click or on increment click is going to be increment. Cool. And then my counter, oh, I put that on the wrong component. Oops, put that on the counter. There we go. And then my count display can accept the count as a prop. Okay, cool. So this is, if you've been using React for a while, you've probably done this kind of refactoring before, but this is a really common type of exercise that you're going to be doing when you're building React applications, and it's called lifting state up. It's been a part of the React documentation since as long as I can remember, and by following this process, you can keep that state as localized as possible without having to add a whole extra abstraction around managing your state. It's really easy for you to find where these different functions are coming from. Sometimes you don't even have to open a separate file. Maybe you do, but it's all within the React component lifecycle, and it's still straightforward to test as well. So here, yeah, we've just got our counter. So sometimes people will see this and they'll say, okay, Kent, well, what about prop drilling pain? So here, if we go to our next slide here, the prop drilling problem. Right here, we're drilling the count as a prop to the count display, and maybe count display is built up of like 30 other components, and you have to keep on passing this count value down to all of those. That can be problematic, because what winds up happening is you say, okay, I'll just take my props, and then I'll return this count thing, and we'll forward all the props, and now you're overpassing props maybe, or underpassing, and it can be a difficult thing to maintain when you're doing this a lot, to forward all these props to different components. So yeah, let me back up. There we go. So prop drilling can potentially be a problem when you're doing it for many levels. If you're just going a couple levels, prop drilling is actually a good thing, because it's really easy to track where your props are coming from. But if it does become a problem, then you can use context. So let's go ahead and use context to implement this kind of thing, so we don't have to worry about drilling. So here, actually, what we'll do first is I'll get rid of these props. I'll get rid of that prop, and we'll no longer pass those props here. But we do still need to manage the state at the least common parent, and so that's this app component here. So how am I going to get the count and the increment to the count display and the counter? And this is where we use context. So I'm going to say our count context equals React create context. And then the count context actually is an object that has a provider component on it. So we can say provider, and we'll come down here and indent those. Provider. Whoa, my keyboard just freaked out. Oh my goodness, what is going on? Provider. Whew. Okay. I did that on purpose just to see if you were still paying attention. No, just kidding. That's actually been happening all day, and I don't know why. Okay, so with the count context provider, we can provide a value that we want to have accessible to all of the children here. So we'll pass our count and our increment function as part of the object for the value here. So now we can access that object in our count display and our counter. And the way we do that is with React hooks. So our React.use context hook with count context. And that's going to give us back our context object. Okay, that context object is going to be whatever the value is at this point. So it is an object that has the count and the increment. So with that, I'm going to just destructure count and increment. And we'll paste that in here. And we've got our count. And then we'll do the same thing to our count display. And now we don't have to do any prop drilling. There's no prop passing at all. That's all just being passed through context. Now, if this was the whole app, I certainly wouldn't use context here. Like I said, prop drilling isn't necessarily a problem. It's only problematic if you're going like many levels or you wind up having to forward a lot of props and that kind of thing. Then it can be problematic. And in those situations, context is a superb solution. And actually, that's how Redux was built. And that's why it was able to solve the problem that everybody reached for it was because it was using context. The reason that people didn't use context before just by themselves is because it used to be that there was this warning that said, hey, don't use context because it's an API that's going to change. And it did change. And it's way better now. And when they made it official, now it's super, like a lot easier to use. And you can use it in lieu of another state management library because React is a state management library. So, and it works with use reducer too. So if you're like, yeah, I can't use state, that, whatever, but I've got like hardcore state management problems here, it works great with use reducer as well. And so you can get all the same benefits of more complex state interactions. Though use state is pretty powerful, so there's that. One last thing that I want to talk about here before I wrap things up, and I guess we'll probably have time for questions too, is collocation. So collocation, I actually have a blog post about this. You can go look that up. Just on my blog, look up collocation. And I talk about this in the context of your HTML and your view, your CSS, your tests, your state, reusable utility files, all of that stuff. And the principle is right here toward the bottom. That you place your code as close to where it's relevant as possible. And when I mentioned this to Dan, he said things that change together should be located as close as reasonable. So basically the same kind of idea. And so whatever you're doing, wherever you're trying to place your code, try to keep it as close to where it's relevant as possible. And the reason for that is because it makes your application easier to maintain, and it actually naturally makes your application faster because you wind up having to render less. And you also are able to do more enhanced code splitting. So here's an example. We've got some actual application level state with our theme provider. That's like for our emotion theme or your solid components theme. Every component that needs to render something visual needs to have access to this theme. And so that's why it's going to be at the global, at the root. The authentication provider, also similar type situation where pretty much all of our components in our app need to know who the user is. They need to maybe change what they display based on whether we have a logged in user or not. And so we're going to put that at the root of our app. And the router as well, that's typically something you're going to need at the root of your app because every component needs to know where it's going to, or when it's going to render on what route and that kind of thing. But there are things that are specific. So we have our notifications. We're going to go to the server, load up those notifications. We only really need to show those on the notification screen. And maybe if you need to have, like in Twitter, you have the bell that shows how many notifications you have. maybe that could be like a special component that just goes and says, how many notifications do I have? Or if you really do want to have that have all of the notifications for your app, then yeah, maybe you can move that up to the root of your app. But then just know that as soon as you do that, now you're making a request for all of the notifications and all of the notification contents, which can be a performance problem. Maybe it's not, but it can be, because the user may never actually go to the notification screen to read that content. So it's trade-offs that you're making here by making that global. The user screen as well, maybe we only need all of the user's information on that user screen. And then any component that needs to access the state can just use these custom hooks that use React use context. So it's actually, you can kind of build your own abstraction for your application state management using just React and a couple of easy lines of code. And I've got a blog post about how I typically use context in a way that works out really effectively. So the benefits of co-locating things as close to where they're relevant as possible, including your state, is your code splitting just works. So I could lazily load the notification screen, and I'm not loading all of the stuff that's necessary for the notification provider, for example. The file structure scales really well because in your efforts to keep the state close together, you'll also likely just naturally put the files that are managing that state close together as well, which I recommend in general to keep things that change together as close together as possible. And you reduce indirection because by keeping things closer together, it's easier to identify which files are relevant, and you can more direct there's not the indirection of the action creators and the reducers that handle those action creators and your selectors and all of that stuff. You don't have as much of that because everything's being co-located together. You know exactly where the code is for the thing that for handling the interaction that the user is giving you. So just to wrap things up in review, React is a state management library. It has a ton of great tools for managing state in your application, and I recommend that you spend some time learning those tools. Lift state up or down. I actually, we're pretty good at lifting state up because we're kind of required to. It's impossible to manage, to do things any other way. If you need to share state between these two components, then you have to lift state up. But we're pretty bad at moving state down. And so as you're refactoring things like, oh, these siblings don't need the state anymore, just this one, make sure to keep that state as close to where it's relevant as possible, using collocation as kind of your guiding principle. And use context when prompt drilling is a pain. I would recommend against overusing prompt drilling or overusing context. Prompt drilling is not necessarily a bad thing. So with that, that's everything I've got for you. I do have a weekly mailing list that you can join. I share a blog post every week on something that's useful. This talk was actually based on a blog post, so if you thought this talk was interesting, then that's the kind of thing that I send out on a weekly basis. You can find these slides on my GitHub, and I guess I do have some time for some Q&A if people are interested. But yeah, thanks everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Kent. That was awesome. We do have some time for some questions. So there's two of us. We'll be walking around with mics. Put your hand up. We'll come find you.
Hey, Kent. I don't know if you can see me on the old camera over here.
Yeah, you're on this screen. I am looking at you, but yeah.
So I live here in Philadelphia, but I work for Instructor. So I'm going to be out in Utah in a couple of weeks. So.
Cool.
Shout out for Utah. So question, I've been kind of leaning towards this pattern for a while, away from Redux. But one thing that I really like about the Redux API is the connect higher order component kind of encourages you to split out your kind of dumb UI that just is a pure function of your props with your sort of like stateful stuff. And then that plus a combination of the kind of canonical use of selector functions as a place to extract like memoized data processing I really like that pattern. And so my gut is that there's still room for that in a world where your state, you use the React API for your state. But I'm curious if you think that's the case. If you think that, if you've seen that pattern be used with the React State APIs.
Yeah, so I've actually got somebody's asked me about this on my AMA, and I answered with one of my live stream dev tips with Kent videos on YouTube that you can go check out. Is something about presentation container components. What do you do with hooks or whatever? Basically, the container component is now a hook. And so like all of the, like, let's go grab the state, let's do our selectors, whatever. You make a custom hook that uses or accesses the context, selects the part of the context that you care about, and then and then in your component, your DOM component, you just use that hook to get the state that you need. Personally, I actually never saw a whole lot of value in the separation between a container and presentation component, but I know a lot of people do, and that's the answer that I give is pretty much you can use or you can get the benefit by using custom hooks. Hooks are just so awesome. That composability model is really flexible. So I think that anybody who likes that container presentation type model will really feel pretty happy with custom hooks in that scenario.
Here, we got another one for you.
Hey, thank you so much. I completely agree. I've ditched Redux and went completely to hooks. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the few use cases where you really need Redux?
So I think one of the best use cases I can think for Redux is a plugin architecture. Like, so if you're making an application that is pluggable, a really great example of this is Hyperterm. And so that's the terminal from Zeit that is built with Electron, and it's got a ton of plugins. And the only way to really do that effectively and let plugins plug in to state and the goings on of your app is by using Redux, so that people can add their own reducers that handle the actions that you're firing, and they plug in their middleware and whatever else that they need to do. So a plugin architecture for an app is a good use case for Redux. Other than that, I actually I don't really see a whole lot of need for Redux. I actually, there is one other thing. If you need to serialize all of your state, all of your app state for any reason, and then rehydrate your entire app, then Redux can be a good solution for that as well. Not to say that you couldn't do that with regular providers, each one implementing its own serialization, deserialization process or something. It's more out of the box with Redux, I guess is all I'm saying there. But you could definitely do that with regular React context and that kind of thing. But yeah, the biggest reason that it discourage people from using Redux isn't because Redux is necessarily a bad idea in itself, but that the natural inclination for people when they're using Redux is to put too much state into the global store. And that winds up being a real pain. Like you have inline form errors, and you're putting that state into your global Redux store. So now all of a sudden I'm maintaining this little form, just going to change the message or add some validation or something, and I have to open 30 files just to do that effectively. That's a bit of a pain just to trace that. So anyway, I kind of lost track of the question, but there are still use cases for Redux, but thanks to the beauty that is hooks and context, I see those scenarios less and less. I see Redux as a less useful tool now.
Awesome. Thank you, Kent. So yeah, we're going to wrap up. Kent, thank you so much for your time. I know this is it's cool to organize it, but to be like a personal fan of you and have you at the meetup has been really awesome. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem, man. Give it up for Kent.